Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers who are focused on using crypto to bring positive digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and is published every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more, visit our website at GreenPilled.network, where you can download the GreenPilled book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local GreenPilled.network chapter. My guest today on the show is Cedric Warny. Cedric is a machine learning scientist and engineer currently working at Motional, a self-driving car company where he develops ML technology to perceive objects in the environment and predict their behavior. Before that, he was a research scientist at Amazon working on natural language and understanding and conversational AI. And I invited him on the podcast today to talk about Elinor Ostrom and governance work in the Commons. So basically, Cedric has authored this really interesting post called Governance Revolution, in which he argues that the current thinking on governance is too pessimistic and that we're actually in the middle of a revolution in how governance could happen that has been evolving for a long time, but because of the new tools enabled by blockchain technology, enable us to manage the commons in a new way. So I quite enjoyed this episode on Governance Revolution with Cedric Warny, and I think that you are going to as well. Enjoy coordination.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Hey, Cedric, how's it going?
Hey, Kevin. I'm all right. How are you doing?
Pretty good, thanks. I'm excited to get into Elinor Ostrom's work and this beautiful governance post that you wrote together. So why don't you tee us off?
Yeah, so maybe I can talk about the blog post, which is like the combination of some research I did last year. And basically, I argue in the blog post that we are at the outset of a governance revolution. And so first, I explain what I mean by innovation in the domain of governance. So I give a few examples. And then I explore theoretically and historically what kind of environment fosters, a high rate of innovation in governance. And then I look at some deep trends that identify, going on in the world right now, or that have been going on in the world for, the past maybe couple decades, that will create such an environment that has high innovation in governance. And then I identify three main avenues where I expect a lot of innovation in governance in the future.
So we'll have a link to this post. It's entitled Governance Revolution in the show notes right here. Why don't you take us down those three main avenues?
Yeah, maybe I can take a step back and talk about why I think we're at the outset of a governance revolution. And Eventually, I'm hoping we can bring Elinor Ostrom into the picture here. But I like to make a comparison with the outset of the Industrial Revolution. There's this famous British economist, Thomas Malthus, who at the end of the 18th century, so in the late 1700s, wrote this famous book where he was all doom and gloom about the future of humanity, where he was identifying that there was population growth and it was an exponential growth, but the resources to supply that population was only increasing linearly. And so he was forecasting some kind of catastrophe sometime in the 19th century. And of course, that didn't happen. And the parallel I make with Thomas Malthus is that there's a lot of talk these days about, political gridlock, the rise of nationalism, and just an ambient pessimism about the future of governance. And I argue that we are, in the same way that Thomas Malthus was misguided, the pessimists today are also misguided because there's a lot of innovation that is about to happen. So maybe I can give a few examples of what I mean by governance innovation, because it's very intuitive what we mean by technological and scientific innovation. But governance innovation may be a bit confusing for a lot of people. And so maybe I can give a few examples of what I mean by that, and then go over the kind of deep trends or the environments that tend to foster governance innovation. So examples that I go over in my research are, for instance, secret balloting. So if you look at the history of democracy in America, at the very beginning there was open balloting. So people basically were in a crowd and were showing colors, identifying who they were voting for. And so that identified who you're voting for, and it was problematic at the time. And so the idea of secret balloting, which is like fairly obvious to us, was actually had to be invented. It was an idea that someone had at some point. I think it came from Germany, actually. So that's an example of what I mean by governance innovation. Another one that I go over is public debt, for instance, or like central banking, and combining central banking with privileged lending. And so that was a type of innovation in governance, which mostly originated in Great Britain. And it was probably a central factor in Britain taking over the world, essentially.
Let me just play that back real quick. So basically you're saying that the pessimists are wrong because we're on the cusp of all these different revolutions in governance, which are just a continuation of things like secret ballots from back in the day and central bank lending. And so the modern internet, we're about to innovate all these different new mechanisms that are sort of extensions of that long lineage of governance revolution. Did I play that back correctly?
Yeah, so the examples I give are just a few examples of what I mean by innovation, but they're not the kinds of innovation that I expect in the future, obviously. Other examples would be like joint stock companies and limited liability. All I'm trying to say here is that there is such a thing as innovation in governance. I think a lot of people think politics is like this fixed thing, and we have democracy and we have these systems, and nothing's ever going to change anymore because we've reached the pinnacle of how to organize ourselves. And I want to push back against that idea. Another example I go over is something like mandatory vaccinations. I see that as a type of governance innovation. Whether or not you're in favor of that, it's a different debate, but it's a type of innovation. And so the next thing that I want to look at is what is the kind of environment that tends to foster innovation in governance. And so to me, looking at history, the key factor that I identify is the availability of exit options. And so I go over a few historical examples where I found that there was a lot of exit options, and as a result, there was some kind of efflorescence in governance innovation. And so I am happy to go over those. The two main examples I go over is classical Greece, and the other one is Renaissance Italy. And so I show how those two environments, having a lot of exit options, generated a lot of innovation. And then what I do is I go over the deep trends that are happening today and how that is fostering, more exit options, more mobility, and why that is going to lead to more innovation, essentially.
Well, one thing I want to pinch and zoom on there that I think is quite interesting is that in a world in which we're talking about using network states as a way of creating more exit options, do we see the same sort of innovation that we saw in those examples in the internet, because now network states are allowing for more exit options? I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah. So that's one of the avenues of innovation that I go over. And actually, history, again, is a good guide here, because if you look at the example of classical Greece, one of the key features of that environment was it was a set of 1,000 independent city-states that were all in the same area, and they were all independent and like very small entities. And so it can be seen as like a similar situation envisioned by the network state, which is like Balaji's, Srinivasan's idea of like how governance in the future could happen. But there's something similar, of course different, but similar that has happened in the past, and it can be instructive to go back and look at that. And so in terms of, you can argue that classical Greece was a governance revolution of some sort. Some call it a mini enlightenment. There was some amount of scientific and technological revolution, but it was mostly governance revolution. So between like 800 BC and about 300 BC, you find that the per capita consumption in classical Greece doubled, which is like unheard of in pre-modern societies. And the population, was multiplied by 10 or 15 or something like that, through a variety of means, just natural population growth, but also colonization of virgin territories by a lot of Greek cities. There was a lot of migration, so a lot of mobility. So that plays into the theme of exit options. And so, for instance, a quarter of the population of Athens was foreign-born, and foreigners had a lot of rights in Athens. And so this environment of intense competition basically favored the spreading of useful memes, and it lowered transaction costs. It led to high investment in literacy, numeracy, military training, and a lot of innovations like federalism, standard coinage. There was some level of social insurance, some innovation in market regulations, in electoral processes. So all these things are types of governance innovations that really, expanded a lot in that kind of environment. And a similar thing happened in Renaissance Italy. We don't have to go over the details of Renaissance Italy, but I think those are great examples of what happens when exit options increase.
Well, one thing I'd like to pinch and zoom on is that I'm hearing a couple things that are sort of anathema to the standard cypherpunk governance ideas. So basically things like central banks managing the central banks via the Fed, or mandatory vaccinations. And I just want to highlight that because I think in the crypto space, the cypherpunk ideology is much more prominent than the SolarPunk ideology. I consider SolarPunks, of which this podcast is one of them, to be more focused on sustainability, pro-social type things, whereas cypherpunks are more focused on things like privacy and sovereignty and things of that nature. And so I'm wondering, if we play forward Web3, what do you think are going to are we going to re-evolve coercive things like federal banks and mandatory vaccinations? And I'm wondering if you could just respond to the cypherpunk that's sitting on my shoulder and is back on those things as quote unquote innovations of governance.
Yeah, I just want to make clear that when I mentioned those as types of examples of innovation, not necessarily an endorsement, it was just examples of different ways of doing things. And, me being in the adjacent to the crypto space, I am highly critical of the central banking model. And I don't necessarily expect, or at least I hope, that model is not going to triumph in the future. Mandatory vaccination, I'm not qualified to opine on that. But there's interesting stories of, mandatory vaccination for, I forgot when the disease was, but anyways, it was, smallpox. So there's in terms of mandatory vaccination in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there's some crazy stories of mandatory vaccinations in the US, in particular in Massachusetts, where, government agents would break into people's houses and literally handcuff people and vaccinate them against smallpox. So I think that's probably going a little too far, but it's an example of, doing things differently.
Well, being about halfway through the episode, I'm wondering if we could maybe pinch and zoom on how this relates to Elinor Ostrom and her methodology for managing the commons. So it sounds like your ideas are kind of a superset of that. And you studied some of Lynn Ostrom's work, so would love to go there next.
The way I would frame Lynn Ostrom into this is that in a world where there's more exit options, because people have become more mobile, and goods and services are becoming more and more deterritorialized, and where cities, as opposed to nation states, are becoming the more preeminent political units, and where identity is no longer stuck in a government database in the form of like identity cards, but in forms of public cryptographic keys, the mobility and the exit options are much higher. And so the kinds of future experimentation that I foresee are first layered governance, which is similar to Balaji's idea of network states. So we can go over that maybe later. A second big avenue of exploration that I foresee is proprietary governance. And the third one that I foresee is what I call state-reinforced self-governance. And that's where I think the work of Lynn Ostrom comes in. And the big picture idea is that if you have exit options, meaning you can move to a different place, or that has a different, regulatory environment, or you can move your assets to a different jurisdiction, the epistemic quality of your voice increases. And a lot of people see those two things as substitutes, but I argue that they're complements a lot of the time. And the way they're complements is that when you have an option to exit a system by even, for instance, voting with your feet or moving your assets in a different jurisdiction, this is a choice that is guaranteed to pay off. You know exactly what the outcome is going to be. So it makes sense to invest in informing yourself about what the outcome would be. Whereas voice has not that guaranteed payoff. When you vote on something, your vote most of the time doesn't actually matter that much. And so it doesn't make sense to invest in informing yourself that much. But when both exit and voice overlap, then it makes sense to invest in informing yourself. And so the example I like to give is with the appearance of Bitcoin and blockchain on the scene, you have an exit option in terms of what to do with your assets or your money or your savings. And so it makes sense to educate yourself about what money is or what is a good monetary policy. And in that process, your voice on the topic of monetary policy becomes way better. Like the epistemic quality of your voice increases. And so this ties to Lynn Ostrom's work because the way I would frame her work is she pushes back against a pessimism that is related to some kind of helplessness that people have regarding politics. And in particular, she looks at the domain of the CPR, common pool resources. And what she shows is that people can solve their problems. You don't need necessarily an external savior. And a lot of what I would call bad philosophy in that domain is captured by this famous paper by Garrett Hardin in 1968 about the tragedy of the commons, where he argues that if you have a common resource like meadows, where nearby farmers can let their animals graze, you'll almost inevitably end up in a situation of overgrazing or overconsumption and depletion of the common resource. And that's what's known as the tragedy of the commons. And this is what I mean by a philosophy of helplessness and some kind of pessimism. And I think that has permeated a lot of the zeitgeist. and in the form of game theory, tragedy of the commons, impossibility theorems, like, Arrow's impossibility theorem from the 1950s, and trolleyology, the thought experiments where you have access, you're managing a trolley and you have to decide life and death for different people. All these stances, I think, have one thing in common, which is an assumption in fixity of knowledge, fixity of choices. And what Elinor Ostrom argues in her work is that choices are not fixed. Knowledge can be created and we can solve our problems. Whereas people who subscribe to these bad philosophies typically end up with a similar solution, which Elinor Ostrom would call legal centralism. So that's the idea that you appeal to an all-wise external enforcer, usually via litigation, to solve your problems, essentially. And she pushes back against that, essentially.
So it feels like reading Between the Lines, there's a lot of opportunity to take Elinor Ostrom's principles for managing the commons and bring them into the digital age and counter some of this negativity on governance that people see.
Yes. And what I like about her work is that she uses a lot of different tools, not just modeling. Economics is heavy on modeling, which is a common criticism of economics, but she uses not only modeling, also econometrics and anthropology and fieldwork. And that's what I really like about her work. And lots of, down to the ground fieldwork. And I think the best way to talk about her work is through some of her case studies. So I'm happy to do that if you think that would be useful.
Yeah, let's go into a couple of case studies. I think that'll really ground it for the listener.
First, maybe I can talk about the two main pushbacks she has, and then pick a specific example of a case study. So the main pushbacks she has is first against centralization, and the second one is against technocracy in a way. So by centralization is what I meant by legal centralism, where we tend to appeal to an all-wise external enforcer. And in the case of the tragedy of the commons, it would be nationalization of the commons, essentially. And technocracy, the pushback she has there is that people tend to think that external experts, by looking and analyzing a system from outside, can tweak the rules and design incentives such that the problem goes away, essentially, without them being deeply embedded in the system. And so she pushes back against that. And she's done a lot of field work in forest management and irrigation systems, for instance. In forest management, she looked at places like Nepal, Thailand, India. And what she shows is that in a lot of cases, not all the cases, but in a lot of cases, when you switch from market provision of forest management services to nationalized public provision of the services, often the quality actually goes down. In a similar story for irrigation systems, I don't think she carried those studies herself, but people affiliated with her research program have. And her own research, and in her book, Governing the Commons, she spends a lot of time on a specific case study in the 1950s in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, where she looked at groundwater systems. And I think that's a good illustration. So maybe we can dive a little deeper into that situation. So in the LA metropolitan area is a semi-arid region, and water supply is a very important governance issue. And the main supply of water in the 1950s came from groundwater, essentially. You had a few big basins in the LA metropolitan area. And the problem was that you had the landowners that were sitting on top of those groundwater basins. And then you had what's called appropriators, which were pumping water from the groundwater basin. So both the landowners on top, it's called overlying landowners, and appropriators. An example of an appropriator would be a water company that is supplying a nearby town, for instance. And maybe an example of an overlying landowner would be a farmer that happens to have property on top of the basin. And everyone was pumping from those basins. And those basins, there were three main basins. One was inland, and one was clearly adjacent to the ocean, and another one was kind of in between those, the coast and inland. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because those different basins face different problems. And the problems they were facing is accessing what's called a safe yield, where you pump too much water, essentially. And so the level goes down and you risk depletion of the resource. And also, if you're nearby the ocean, if you pump too much and the level of water goes down, then you will have like salt water from the ocean seep in, and then you would salinate your basin, which would have terrible consequences because you wouldn't have drinkable water anymore. And so this is the situation, the problem, the tragedy, the comments that these people were facing. And so the common wisdom would say, oh, we're doomed unless the central government intervenes. And what Elinor Ostrom shows is that people were able to solve these problems.
And I think that's powerful in a world in which there is no global government that's going to sort of lord over the entire internet. If we can find bottoms-up ways of solving these commons problems, then that's huge.
Yes, exactly. And so I think it's interesting to go over some of the specific solutions they implemented for this situation, and it illustrates why she's being optimistic. And I think the theme of your podcast, which is regenerative crypto economics, I think plays into that optimistic vision of the world where we can ourselves solve our problems. We don't need like an external savior. And so the way they fix their problems is through a variety of tools. And the first thing they had to do is measure, generate data about the current situation. How much water are we actually pumping out of those groundwater basins? And that will set the picture for any future negotiation. And so that's the first thing they did. And I think they funded partly themselves. So the overlying landowners, the appropriators. It was also partly funded by the state of California, I believe. So the geological survey that would establish how much water is being pumped and what's the safe yield. So they did that. So that leverages some government institution. And I think that's a theme that we'll see is recurring in Elinor Ostrom, is the concept of what she calls generalized government facilities. And what I like about that term is the term facility. And it's a style of government that Elinor Ostrom espouses. So it's the idea that solutions to your problems should not be driven by the top, but they should be facilitated by the top and driven by the bottom. And this story, I think, illustrates this. So the facility in this case was a geological survey. And then they had to, once they knew what the safe yield was and they realized they were in overdraft, meaning they were pumping more than the safe yield, they had to cut back. And so the question becomes, who cuts back, essentially? Because obviously everyone prefers the other people to cut back and not themselves. And the interesting situation is that there was a conflict of legal doctrines for who has a right to pump water. There's the classic riparian rights doctrine, where if you happen to have property on top of this groundwater resource, then you have a right to use it. There's another doctrine of appropriative rights. So if you're appropriating the water to, let's say, supply a nearby town with water, that's an allowed use. And then there's the prescriptive rights doctrine, where if you're not an overlying landowner, if you're not an appropriator, but you happen to have been using this resource for a long time, you have prescriptive rights to that resource. There are a lot of legal doctrine, conflicts, and they negotiated amongst themselves and decided of a solution of mutual prescription. So everyone has prescribed water use against everyone, essentially. And so that leads to a proportional cutback in water use, essentially. So then they went to court to enforce that voluntary agreement. So that's a second example of a generalized facility provided by the government, where you come in with a voluntary agreement and then it's enforced by the government. The third example of a government facility is for the salination problem. So some of the basins were having salt water seeping into their basins. And so what they did is they created a new district that encompassed multiple basins. And there was no existing political district to deal with that. So they had to create a new district, which is a type of facility provided by the government. And this district would be responsible for creating a water barrier. So they would inject water between the ocean and the ground basin as a barrier against salination. And so from that, they had to, bring water to inject. So they had to purchase water from like Southern California. And they leveraged government institutions to do that, like one to purchase the water and another one to inject the water. And to funnel that, they created this special district that was raising money through a pump tax. And so all these examples are examples of people solving problems on their own by leveraging generalized institutional facilities provided by the government. And it illustrates Elinor Ostrom's concept of polycentric governance. Towards the end of her life, if she had to summarize her philosophy, she would use the term polycentric governance. And what polycentric means here is that you have different levels of governance. You have the level of a single basin where, the overlying landowners, the appropriators get together into an association. Then they have a water master, which monitors the level of pumping of each party. And then you have this regional district, special district that encompasses multiple basins. And then you have the courts that enforce a voluntary agreement. And then they also had to pass some legislation at the state level. So you have all these different centers of governance that are not necessarily hierarchically organized, but kind of overlapping jurisdictions. And that's what she meant by polycentric governance. And so to conclude, this is, I think, the lesson of Elinor Ostrom is that people have the power to solve their problems, essentially. If you have a situation of a CPR where people are incentivized to pump water as much as possible and destroy the resource, people are smart, they'll invent solutions, choices on their own, leveraging generalized institutional facilities. And so it's a very optimistic view of the future.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it. I feel like the word polycentric is something that we're increasingly hearing in the pluralism space and in the public good space in Web3. And so it might be too reductionist, but that's maybe a good way to sum this up.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
Well, we only have 10 minutes left, so I guess we've got to start moving into wrapping up. I'm wondering, if you're maximally successful, if this governance revolution happens, what do you think the world looks like in 5 or 10 years?
That's a tough one. I think success for me, I mean, there's nothing personal. This is not like a company that I'm pitching or anything. It's mostly talking about ideas. What I'm hoping for the future is more experimentation. And so I would like to see more experimentation in layered governance. So that's an idea similar to what Balaji is pitching the world right now with the network state. I want to see more innovation in proprietary governance. What I mean by proprietary governance is experimentation in different types of ownership. So for instance, in America, there's a lot of incentive towards what's known as fractionated ownership. Like a typical example is common interest developments, of which the most popular form is HOAs. And I think there's a way to innovate on top of that. For instance, if you look at the commercial real estate market, it's very uncommon for companies and private outfits to own the land on which their offices are. And it's actually also fairly rare to own their own offices. They mostly lease them. And so I think that's one space, innovation space, where I expect a lot of innovation. Where in terms of residential real estate, we don't see that much. We see mostly people owning the land on which their houses are. But this is mostly an artifact of policy. It's not an artifact of culture. I think a lot of people believe there's this thing in American culture where people want to own their house and own their land. And I think that's an artifact of policy, not a deeply embedded thing in culture. There's policy reasons for why people want to own a house and own land. And I think in the future, if we manage to remove those biases in legislation and regulation, we'll see a ton of innovation and different ways of organizing the way we live. So that's one area of innovation that I expect to see. To go back towards layered governance, there's this movement of special economic zones, which has been going on for, I don't know, about 60, 70 years now. I think the first special economic zone happened in Ireland in the 50s. And the innovation I expect there is a lot more SEZs, special economic zones, and then alliances between SEZs. So for instance, you may have heard of charter cities, and charter cities is like a subtype of special economic zone, essentially. And if you want to use crypto terminology, you could define an SEZ as a hard fork of the background governance. So a hard fork is typically when you remove constraints, remove rules. An equivalent soft fork in that space would be a common interest development. So an HOA is just adding rules on top of the background rules, whereas an SEZ is removing rules. So it's hard fork versus a soft fork. So I expect a lot more soft forks from background governance. And so these special economic zones could be the source of what I would call a second layer of governance, which is similar to Balaji's notion of a network state. The difference is mostly in how this happens. So the way I imagine that to happen is SEZs hard forking from the background governance and then creating a second layer of governance. And I think the example of Estonia illustrates what that would look like. So Estonia is famous for, digitalizing what they say. They claim 99% of their administrative public services are digitalized, and they have good reasons to do that. One reason is that they're concerned that Russia maybe might decide one day to invade them, and so they want to be able to boot up their country in a completely virtual way. And so they have actually backup servers in several other countries besides Estonia, where they back up their data. And so if they were to, if they were happened to be invaded, they could theoretically boot up their government systems and become a purely virtual country, which is an interesting idea. And so imagine applying that to an alliance or a coalition of cities that are in SEZs. So they have room for maneuver in terms of governance because they've hard forked from the background governance. And so they could create alliances at that second layer. And so you could imagine a world where you belong to a community in a similar way that you're a Google employee. When you're a Google employee and you fly into Berlin and Google has an office in Berlin, your badge works. It's like you don't need your American driver's license to walk in. You have a badge, and it works in New York. It works in Berlin. You walk in and you have access to familiar infrastructure, whether that's monitors or kitchen or laptops. I don't know, whatever infrastructure Google has. Imagine that, but for a country, essentially, or public services. And so I think that's a future that is possible, and that could be really interesting.
Well, quite a beautiful vision. I'm wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask that you want to tell us about, Cedric.
I think we covered a good amount. So I think maybe one thing that I would like to emphasize is that a world where there is this layered governance depends heavily on what I've called the deterritorialization of goods and services. And I think providing a few examples of that trend could be helpful. So for instance, I think the supply chain in general is becoming way more abstract. You order things on Amazon and they land on your doorstep, whether you live in the US or in Europe or many other countries. It's the same kind of abstract supply chain. You've seen a boost in telehealth, for instance, and the COVID-19 pandemic has helped boost that. You have movements like online schooling, of which a good example is the school Synthesis, which is a spin-off of the school that Elon Musk, created at Starbase in Texas for his kids and his employees' kids. The founder of that basically generalized the school and made it open to the public. And it's like an online-first school for kids, which is highly successful. There's a big movement towards moving towards online arbitration services to, settle disputes. Banking, of course, especially with crypto, is being deterritorialized. Even socialization is happening now online first. So, for instance, I belong to a network called Interintellect, where it's like a bunch of people from all over the world that organize salons. We have conversations about various topics. And there's also this thing you might have seen on Twitter called Teapot. It stands for This Part of Twitter. It's like a bunch of people who, during the pandemic, basically started hanging out online on Twitter. And so they made friends online first, and then they met in real life via events like VibeCamp. Maybe you've heard of VibeCamp.
Of course, yeah.
And so that's an example of, all these things are becoming more and more virtual. And so if you combine this trend with cities becoming the preeminent political unit, I think you will see really interesting dynamics in the future where cities are no longer mainly job markets, but they're mainly consumption bundles. And so you're no longer, cities will no longer be like a phenomenon of economic agglomeration, but a phenomenon of affinity-based agglomeration. And then you could see this virtual layer develop more and more. So I think that's really interesting and inspiring for the future.
Yeah. Well, what a beautiful place to end on. Cedric, thanks so much for appearing on the GreenPilled podcast. And there'll be links in the show notes. If you're listening, check out Cedric on Twitter. and then also his Governance Revolution post, which I found to be a really great read, and I think the listeners will too. Thanks so much, Cedric.
Thank you.